very much. Thank you very much, Harni, and thank you very much as well, Dr. Sonia. And thank you for all of you for being here, especially during fasting. I can imagine, 1 o'clock is about lunchtime, and so you'd be starting to feel quite hungry. I very much understand. I have a number of students that when class finishes, or our class kind of finishes at about 5:30 or 6 p.m. here in Australia, and they'll rush off immediately because they're allowed to eat. So I understand. So thank you very much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. So I'll just share my screen. So as I said, thank you very much for having me. As we go through, feel free to ask any questions while we're going through. So you can put up your hand, or you can write in the chat if that's easier, or just unmute yourself and ask. I'm very happy to get distracted and talk about whatever you want to talk about as we go, as happens. But otherwise, today, what I'm going to talk about is how we can understand certain aspects of academic discourse. So the language of school, the language of university, the language in different subject areas. This is a huge area, as I'm sure you are all aware, both as foreign language teachers or becoming foreign language teachers, but also just as students yourself who have engaged with lots of different subject areas. You know that the types of reading and the types of writing you need to do in different subjects can be very difficult and very different as we go. What that means is when we're teaching students, whether this be in their first language or in a second or foreign language, we need to be very conscious of the language demands of what we're trying to get them to learn and to help teach them those language demands. And today, what I'm going to focus on, there are many aspects of academic discourse, but I'm going to focus on two particular aspects that I'm going to call technicality, which is about content meanings, and another one which you might not have come across before. I don't think it was in that chapter, called iconization here. So I'll explain what that is. As I said, I'm just recovering from COVID, so every now and again I might just need to mute myself to cough. So I apologize for that. So as we've just said, for students to effectively learn English or any language, whether this be a foreign language, whether this be their third or fourth language or their first language, they need to learn to speak and write and read in a range of situations. This means that any EFL or English as foreign language programs must make explicit how English works differently in different contexts. So I'm going to be talking about English here, but everything I talk about applies to all languages and all language teaching all the way through. So as you would know, the way we speak in terms of conversation and chat with people is quite different to the way we write in terms of write essays, or the way we might speak or write in a professional context. And learning all these different types and ways of speaking and reading and writing is, of course, tremendously difficult. It's tremendously difficult for everyone, especially if it's in a second language. For students who are going to use English or another language in educational and professional contexts, whether they're going to study overseas or study, in another language at home, or whether they're going to work, this also, of course, applies to, students within, within Indonesia who might speak, say, Bahasa Sunda, or another language who having to learn Bahasa Indonesia as they move into school and the like. One of the key registers, one of the key ways in which language works in English, or situations in which language works, is academic discourse, the language of education and academic knowledge. And typically, academic discourse organizes highly complex meanings into quite dense texts, and so it can be very difficult for students to learn. Learning academic discourse is especially difficult when students are learning the content knowledge at the same time. So for this reason, when teaching content knowledge, it's also important to teach language. And this is where Dr. Hartney herself has done a lot of really fantastic research. And actually, Hartney, I'm going to get in touch with you soon because I might have a student who I'm going to be directing toward you. So anyway, to look at your work. So Dr. Hartney here has done a lot of research into how content knowledge can be taught at the same time as the teaching language in multilingual classrooms. As students know, one of the trickiest areas of academic discourse to learn is the specialized terminology of a subject. All subjects have particular terminology, and in every subject it's different and it's hard. In different subjects, different terminology and vocabulary will be used in very particular ways that may be very different to everyday common sense discussion. And so as teachers, to help students with this terminology, we need to make explicit the meanings of these different terms and how they relate to other ones. All of this, I'm hoping at this stage you all understand and accept that, you know, we need to teach the words of a particular subject or a particular language. But here I'm going to start getting into some of the tricky parts of doing this. Because importantly, different academic disciplines will tend to use different types of vocabulary with different types of meaning. And there are lots and lots and lots of different types here. I'm just going to be focusing on two, but there are lots here. Some might emphasize highly technical content meanings. So really complex content meanings, like if you are in science, in biology or something, or in, I don't know, if you're learning about grammar, there's lots of content meanings in order to understand how a language works, really complex. Others, on the other hand, maybe in history, or if you're doing literature or poetry, studying literature or poetry, or maybe if you're studying art or other humanities subjects. Some won't use many technical content meanings, but might emphasize highly values-laden knowledge. So terms that indicate what your moral position is, or your political position is, or what your ethical position is, or maybe what your judgments are aesthetically. So in terms of, you know, what looks nice or looks terrible, for example. And these are a different type of terminology that are just as rich as technical terms, but can be very difficult to see and understand. Very difficult to see and understand. So what I'm going to do today is step through these two different types and how we might be able to understand their meanings and how they might be different. I'm going to start with technicality. The reason I'm going to start with technicality with the content meanings is because in general, when we learn a language or learn another subject, learn a new subject, or both together, we can generally see the technical terms and we know that we don't understand the meaning. We see the word and go, I have no idea what that means. And so we look it up and we kind of get the definition and go, well, maybe I now know what it means, but you know, I now know what it means, or I need to study more. We can see it. I'm going to go through how the different types of meaning might be involved to make this meaning a bit more explicit to students. But then I'm going to go through this iconization, which is the more interpersonal, moral, political, ethical meanings that can be really tricky, and we can often miss that they're there. So to come at this, I'm going to view it through what systemic functional linguistics, which I'm not sure how much you've done systemic functional linguistics. If you're with Dr. Hartney, I'm sure she's mentioned it a little bit at least, but what SFL calls register. And there's a number of different aspects to register. I'm going to do two. Register includes sets of resources for organizing our experience and content meanings, so organizing the world around us, which is known as field, or resources for organizing our social relationships, known as tenor. So I'm going to use terms or concepts from field and tenor today, and I'll explain them as we go. So as I said, one of the most common and most easily recognizable forms of specialized terminology is known as technicality. And all the way through, I'm going to try to use green for technicality. So whenever we see a word in green, it's a technical term or is something to do with technicality. Technicality synthesizes highly complex content meaning into single words. It's often associated with knowledge in the sciences, biology, physics, chemistry, the social sciences like linguistics, or I don't know, psychology or something along those lines. Or if, I'm not sure whether in that first chapter that Dr. Harni has asked you to read, the second half of it mentions a thing called legitimation code theory. I'm not sure whether you actually read that part, but it's often what legitimation code theory calls knowledge codes, organized toward content knowledge. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, not important. For example, here is an elementary school book that is teaching some really early physics. So it's teaching technical or complex meanings for this level about the physical world. And in particular, it's teaching about the technical term force in physics. So I'll just read it to you and then we'll look through it. So here what it's going to do is describe when forces occur and what are forces. You use a force every time you move something, change its direction or change its shape. So describing what a force does. A push is a force. See page 6. So classifying a push as a force. A pull is a force. You use pushing and pulling forces to twist and turn things too. This is a whole book. This is just one page. But importantly, it's setting up a little bit of technicality in force here. Or we can look at a much denser text that uses, excuse me, a lot of technicality. This is from senior high school. This is from the final year of high school. And it's in fact a textbook that I used when I studied my final year of high school. And this is in physics, very technical, and it's describing different types of matter, different types of particles. If you've never done physics or never done physics in English, don't worry if you have no idea what any of these words mean. I'm just pointing out that there's a lot of technicality. So physicists currently view matter, I've got all the technicality in green. Physicists currently view matter as being grouped into 3 families: quarks, leptons, and bosons. The standard model explains interactions in terms of these families, which it further classifies as matter particles. These are fundamental particles. That is, they have no known smaller parts. They are quarks and leptons. Force carrier particles. Each type of fundamental force is caused by the exchange of force carrier particles, also called messenger or exchange particles. These are fundamental or gauge bosons. They include photons or gluons. Now, has anyone done any physics? And does anyone, if so, does anyone understand, did anyone understand any of that? No, fair enough. Fair enough. I've kind of forgotten what it means as well, but that's okay. Importantly for us, when students are learning physics in English or in Bahasa Indonesia or in, I don't know, Mandarin Chinese or say Bahasa Sunda or whatever, they will have to use, they'll come across texts that are highly dense with this type of technical terminology. So what we want to do is understand how we can understand the meanings of these terms and help unpack them for students. So technicality is what we mainly think of when we have to teach the terminology of a subject. And we can usually find their meanings in textbooks or glossaries or dictionaries or Wikipedia. That's what I use a lot of. When I don't know what a word means, I Google it. There it is. Importantly, a technical term, technicality, is often defined in terms of other technicality. So in order to describe what a technical term means, you need to use other technical terms very often. So if I was to explain to you what a photon means, I would have to explain to you different types of particle and the nature of light using other technical terms. So what we're going to see, what we're going to look at are the different kinds of meaning that technicality often has through what I said is called field. So, one of the most common meanings or types of meaning for understanding technical terms is where a technical term has different types or subtypes. And this is called classification. So we'll look at an example. For example, in this elementary school text, it notes that pushes and pulls are types of force. A push is a force. A pull is a force. What it's done is defined force as a push and a pull, or a pull and a push as a type of force. It's classified them. It's taken technicality and classified it. And we can draw it like this. This is a very simple one. But here, if we need to explain to students what a force is, at this level, we can say one type of force is a push, one type of force is a pull. But classification taxonomies can be very elaborate in the later years of school. So for example, our secondary school physics text produces a very, very big taxonomy where each technical term is defined in terms of other technical terms. So this is all of them. And in fact, after this stretch, the text has a table that specifies many different types of quark and lepton. So here it's got quark and lepton. It specifies lots of different types. Now, I'm not going to go through them all, but I can say that in the stretch of one or two paragraphs in the table, it sets up a classification taxonomy that looks like this, where it says there are matter, there are two types of matter particles and force carrier particles, and force carrier particles can be called messenger or exchange or gauge bosons. Within force carrier particles, there are two types, gluon and photon. Within matter particles, there are quarks and leptons. And within leptons, there are these types. Within quarks, there are these types. Big technicality defined by other technicality here. This is one of the main ways in which technicality is built, through classification. When we're explaining terms to students, it helps to make explicit the types and subtypes like this so that they can see how they all interact. Alternatively, rather than type or subtype, technicality can indicate parts of something. And so set up a part-whole relation, what's known as a composition taxonomy. So not classification, but composition. For example, in the same physics textbook, it states, hydrogen atoms are simple with a single electron orbiting a nucleus. A proton is made up of one up quark and one down quark. Okay, series of technicality, but here it's not saying that an electron is a type of hydrogen atom, it's saying that an electron is a part of a hydrogen atom. So we can kind of describe it in terms of this diagram. A hydrogen atom includes an electron and a nucleus. A nucleus has a proton has up quarks, two up quarks, and a down quark. So what we're trying to do here is get a sense of how we can visualize or make explicit the technical terms for students as they need it. One way is classification, types. One way is composition, part whole. But we can do even more than that. It's not just types or part wholes. What classification and composition types and wholes often do is put relations between things or items. But technicality can also be involved in relationships between events or happenings, what are known as activities. So, for example, in a senior high school biology textbook, we can have the technical activity or event inflammation, where part of the body becomes inflamed, swells, becomes very red, sore when you hurt yourself. And the biology textbook is trying to explain what inflammation is and how it works. And rather than saying there are different types of inflammation or there are parts of inflammation, we can unpack information as being a series of other activities, series of other technical terms. So what information is, for example, is an increased diameter and permeability of blood vessels, followed by phagocyte migration, followed by phagocytosis, followed by tissue repair. All of that together is inflammation. Now, again, don't worry if you don't understand the technical terms. I'm not a biologist, so I know some of them, but not all of them. But importantly for us, what we're doing is looking at the relationships or the ways to be able to describe what inflammation is. Similarly, one of these terms, phagocytosis, can be unpacked even further as involving the detection, then ingestion, then phagosome forms, then fusion with the lysosome, then digestion, then discharge. Again, don't worry if you don't understand what they mean. The important thing for us is, one of the ways we can understand technicality is when it's an event, what are the different events within it? What are the different events that make up this technical event? What are the series of activities? And finally, technicality can involve not types or subtypes or part whole or events, but qualities of things, descriptive qualities, what are known as properties. And properties are regularly used to measure things or describe them as having more or less of something. More energy, less energy, bigger, smaller, something along those lines. So for example, in physics, the property of wavelength, so wavelength being the length of a wave that is going, whether that be a wave in the ocean or a wave of light or whatever, wave of sound. Property of wavelength allows different things to be measured as being longer or shorter, often on graphs. So here, for example, I have a graph. Now we're moving toward a little bit of multimodality. Dr. Honey mentioned that you've done a little bit of this, a little bit of multimodality. Well, here we've got these H's are different types of different bands of light, and they are measured in terms of different wavelengths. This one has a shorter wavelength, 364.6 nanometers. This one is slightly longer, this one's slightly longer, this one's slightly longer, and this one's very long. So, importantly for us, one of the ways in which specialized terms occur in subjects like the sciences or in academic discourse is through technicality that synthesize highly complex content meanings into single terms. So when we're working with students and trying to teach them the language of a subject area, or maybe give them resources so that they can themselves learn technical terminology so that they can go and look at it themselves, we can look at it in terms of these 4 different types of meaning, 4 different ways of meaning. Classification, including type and subtype. Composition, including parts of things. Series of activities, so a series of events. Or properties that measure things, more or less. Now, in practice, when you get into higher level academic discourse, when you get to, say, late secondary school or you get into university, all of these occur at once. And it becomes very, very, very dense. That's how these things work. But this is why it's useful to be able to unpack and look at different types. I have a student at the moment, a PhD student, who's currently who's working with medicine lecturers in China who are teaching in English. So both the lecturer and all of the students are EFL, English as Foreign Language students, learning medicine, surgery, and the like. And unpacking these meanings is spectacularly intricate, but needs to be done so that they can understand the medical discourse, for example. Now, I'm not sure what level, what year, what ages, whether... Dr. Harni, Are your students working in schools like primary or secondary or adult or what?
Yeah, almost all levels. Yeah.
All levels, okay. Yeah. So this will be different at different levels, but these same meanings will likely occur, just more complex or less complex, depending on what level you're at. So that's one set of specialized terminology called technicality, where we can understand them in terms of the content meanings, in terms of field, in terms of classification or composition or activity or property. But another type of specialized terminology that your students and you will come up against in every language, whether it be their first language or another or second language, is terminology that's often used in subjects like, as I said, history or literature or art, which is not technicality as such. If you read a lot of English literature or Indonesian literature, Bahasa Indonesia literature, or whatever, they don't use much technical terms, but they do use some very, very, very specialized, difficult words all the way through. It's just that they're different types. Rather than indicating content meanings, like classification, composition, this terminology often indicates different interpersonal meanings. So different relations between meanings in terms of political stances or moral stances or religious stances or ethical stances or aesthetic positions. Aesthetic positions meaning like your judgments of whether something is, pretty or not, in terms of art. They often indicate your judgment of something. What that means, though, is because different terms might be used to refer to the same thing, you might not notice that you're using a term that might not be appropriate for a particular situation because it says something you don't mean to say. Specialized terminology that indicates particular interpersonal stances, we can call iconization or iconized terms. I won't go into why it's called iconization, but sets up, I won't go into why it's called iconization, but it's called iconization, which is distinct from technicality. So iconization is a way of synthesizing a range of interpersonal meanings together into one word. It's often what's described as the connotations of a word. I'm not sure if that's a word that you guys have used. So connotations being not the kind of explicit definition meanings, but what it might indicate. But in particular, I'm talking about ones that are used in specialized fields. So not everyday common connotations, but ones that are used in like academic discourse. It's the same type of thing though. But iconization can be very difficult to see. Students and everyone who is learning a new language or going into a new community can easily use words that are correct in terms of their content meaning, but are wrong or offensive or inappropriate in terms of their interpersonal meanings, or indicate something about your political positioning or your judgment of something that you don't mean to indicate. The difficult thing for students learning academic discourse is these words are very heavily used in the humanities, like in history or in literature. How you describe, not being from Indonesia, I obviously don't understand, say, Indonesian history nearly as well as all of you, but I'm going to guess that how you describe the last 60 years, 70 years of Indonesian politics in terms of how you describe, say, Sukarno's presidency and Suharto's presidency will say a lot about what you think of those times and what your political positioning is. And if I learnt Bahasa Indonesia and tried to explain those things, I would very likely say things that are very bad and very wrong without meaning it. I would try to describe something and probably the phrase in English is put my foot in it, accidentally step in something that is really bad that I had no idea I was stepping into. And that happens all the time. And it's difficult, as we all know. But the question is, how can we see these meanings? How can we understand these meanings? And how can we explain them and unpack them for students so that they can at least see some of them and understand that they might be there? I'm going to use examples from Australia just because that's the area I know. So, you know, I will try to make explicit these meanings in English in Australia. And, you know, hopefully, if you don't know them, this will be helpful for you as well. So, for example, in Australia, there is a range of terms that can be used to describe the first peoples on the continent. So not the Europeans that came into Australia in the 18th century, in the 1700s and colonized, but the people that were there beforehand for a very long time and are still in Australia. Over time, different words may become more or less appropriate depending on the situation. And importantly, these things change over time. Just as technical terms change as science progresses, these terms change as humanities progresses. So this is a little smaller, but I just wanted to try and get it on one slide. So currently, at least in some circles and communities, the most appropriate terms to use are often First Nations peoples or Indigenous peoples. And there's a few things here. There's Indigenous that are here, you know, for a long time. First Nations is emphasizing that they're the people who were here before Europeans had their own nations that were distinct. And also we use the plural to emphasize that they weren't just one people. Just like in Indonesia, before colonizers came, it's not as if there was just one people who all considered themselves the same. That was a thing that came after colonization and when nationalization came. Here I'm starting to, you know, move into Indonesian politics. So if I put my foot in it and say something really awful, please, please tell me, because I don't mean to. So I'm going to stay with Australia. So those are the kind of the most appropriate terms. Or alternatively, you can use the specific name of a people. So the land in which I'm on, the people who were here, that I'm speaking on, were known as the Gadigal, or are known as the Gadigal people. Alternatively, we might use the term Aboriginal people. Now this refers to the same thing in terms of the content meanings, more or less, not entirely, but close enough. But nowadays it's ever so slightly less appropriate, but can be used in certain situations. I'm not going to go through the situations, but you can. If we go a bit further, quite old-fashioned terminology and now somewhat inappropriate terms that suggest a kind of conservative political stance are words like Aborigine or natives. If you use that nowadays, although it refers to the same thing, it has a kind of, it suggests, well, it's a bit inappropriate, basically. It suggests that you're a bit conservative in your political stances. And very old-fashioned and highly inappropriate and offensive words include savages or primitive peoples or a wide range of derogatory insults. Things you might have read 70 years ago, in English at least, that no, you do not say this, you do not use these terms. Now, importantly for us, in terms of their content meanings, in terms of their field, they all kind of refer to the same thing, the same people. But in terms of their interpersonal meanings, in terms of iconization, they are very different. So what we want to do is, what we want to do is be able to see what are the distinct meanings here that we can unpack, so that although this one I'm kind of put as a hierarchy, this is better than this, and this. In other situations, there's just a range of different terms that you could use, and no one is better or worse necessarily, they just mean different things. So how can we see these different things? So as I said, importantly, each of these words can refer to the same things in the sense that they can have the same content meanings, but their meanings differ interpersonally in terms of political stances and judgments. So we can look at the meanings just like we can look at technicality in terms of field, like classification and composition and activity and property. We can look at iconization in terms of what systemic functional linguistics calls tenor. Tenor is about the social relations established. If you haven't looked at tenor, don't worry about it. It's just a term we use. So here I'm going to look at another example from Australia about how to refer to the arrival of Europeans in the 1700s. I'm sure, again, where Australia and Indonesia, obviously very different histories, but both of us have histories of colonization of Europeans, although very different histories from then on in many ways. I'm sure this is another area where there are many terms for the arrival of Europeans in Indonesia that would say a lot about what you think about that. So there are two main terms in Australia for the arrival of Europeans. There are a number of others, but two ones that are in political debates and historical debates in history in Australia get debated very much so. Settlement and invasion. In one sense, they both refer to the same thing, the arrival of Europeans in Australia. But which one you use says a lot about your political stances and your view of history. And it's been the basis of what in Australia has been called the history wars. For about 20 or 30 years, historians, in a metaphorical war about the nature of Australian history. Like for technicality, iconized terms often get their meaning in relation to other iconized terms. One of the main relations, one of the main meanings is that terms can be opposed to each other. So here I'm using opposed to mean one of the relations for iconization. What that means is when you use one, it is in opposition to another. You use one and it means that you are not using the other. It's rare that you will bounce between the two, or rather you'll bounce between the two, but only in different situations, not in the same conversation. So, in this sense, invasion is opposed to settlement. Those who use invasion will tend to avoid using the term settlement, and those that use the term settlement will tend not to use the term invasion. So they're opposed. So if we're talking to students, why would we use this or not this term? You can say, well, they're opposed to each other. You use one or the other, and it says something about you. In addition to this opposition between invasion and settlement, using one or the other indicates that you might also use other terms. It might be a bit kind of tricky to wrap your head around, but you would feel it intuitively. If you use what we can call using like terms or likening. So for example, the people that use the term invasion to refer to Europeans coming to Australia are most likely, I would suggest, and just from the text analysis I've done as well, to refer to the first people in Australia as First Nations peoples or Indigenous peoples. So although they refer to different things, they're likened to each other. That you use this term, you'll probably use this term. Whereas if you use the term settlement, there's more of a chance that you might use the term Aboriginal people or Aborigine or other terms. I should say in Australia, probably the default term is settlement. So if you don't have any reason to do it, people say settlement. But more recently, invasion has become more widely used. But this is the more marked term. It's the one that you kind of consciously think to use here. I'll just flag that. So settlement doesn't necessarily mean that you'll use inappropriate forms. It just means that you won't necessarily think to use the most kind of politically correct forms of other words. Although it's not necessary that you have to use them like this, we often cluster these words together and you can get lots of different lists of words. So in addition to opposing settlement and invasion, or likening settlement with Aboriginal people or invasion with First Nations people and Indigenous people, in addition, which term you use also suggests what you think of the arrival of Europeans, negatively or possibly neutrally, what we can call rejecting or supporting. If you use the term invasion, it sets up a stance that you are evaluating the arrival of Europeans negatively. You are judging it negatively as the start of colonization, the start of likely long-term genocide of the first peoples of Australia, the start of 150 to 200 years of war with those various nations. It's a negative judgment here. If you use the settlement, it doesn't have those connotations. It doesn't suggest that you think of European arrival negatively. It's just neutral, maybe positively, but it's kind of just not negative, basically. Yeah. So these two terms are opposed to each other. They have different stances, positive or negative. And finally, the terms you use suggest something about the communities and the political ideologies you align with. So if you're writing in history, it probably says something about what school of history you align with, or what political community you align with. What we can call sourcing, the sense of what the source of the term is, what the community is. So if you use the term invasion in Australia, it suggests you align with left-wing politics, possibly socialist, possibly left-wing liberal. If you're in history, a kind of socialist history. Whereas if you use the term settlement, it suggests you align with more centre or right-wing politics, maybe conservative politics, relatively conservative history. Now, all of these meanings, if you know the term and you speak and you understand it well, you will know this intuitively. If someone says invasion, you can position what they think about lots of things probably straight away. Same for all of you. There will be so many things in your language and the academic disciplines that you speak that if someone uses that term, you know, they're a good guy. Or you go, oh, I'm worried about them. You know, depending on the academic field you're in, depending on your political stance, depending on what you think about art, for example. But trying to bring that to consciousness and make that explicit for students who don't know this can be spectacularly difficult. And so what I've tried to do is step through a bunch of the meanings to make that explicit. Those meanings being, oops, skipped a slide, oops. Those meanings being oppositions, which term, if you use this term, what is it opposed to? Likening, what other terms, if you use this term, what other terms would you likely use? Rejection or support? By using this term, are you saying this is a good thing or a bad thing? And how good or bad? And sourcing, what community or ideology does it suggest you come from if you use it? Just like technicality for classification or composition or activity or property, oppositions, likening, rejection support, and sourcing are highly specialized, can be highly specialized meanings for different fields. And so as teachers, when we're teaching students academic discourse in these fields, it's really important that we're able to make explicit what these meanings, what these words mean. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to step through all of these, but I'm trying to offer you some tools for how you might step through these different meanings. Okay, there are different types of specialized terminology on top of technicality and iconization. But I think what I will do is finish there. As I said, one of the hardest things for foreign language students to learn is the specialized terminology of a subject in school. And so it's important that as teachers, we teach this explicitly. And what I've tried to show is that these meanings, these terminology can be of two types. There are others, but two types. Those that synthesize content meanings, known as technicality, and those that synthesize interpersonal meanings, known as iconization. And to unpack them and make explicit these meanings, there are a set of different types of meaning: classification, composition, activity, property, or opposition, likenings, support or reject, or sourcing that we can use. And of course, to effectively use a language or use language, it's important to learn both. So I think at that, I will finish. And I didn't go over time, which I'm very pleased with. So thank you very much.